The screams pierced the morning air like metal tearing apart. German Sergeant Klaus Weber pressed his face into the mud of his trench. Around him, 60 explosions hammered the French countryside in rapid succession. Buildings collapsed. Trees splintered. The earth itself seemed to revolt. When the dust settled, Weber looked up through the smoke. He expected to see bombers overhead. Instead, a single American tank sat 300 meters away. Strange tubes jutted from its turret like organ pipes. "What in God's name was that?" whispered his radio man. Weber had no answer. He'd fought in Russia. He'd survived Normandy. But this was different. This was the Sherman Calliope, and it was about to change everything. Picture American engineers in 1943 studying reports from the Eastern Front. Soviet Katyushas were devastating German lines with rocket barrages. But those weapons sat on vulnerable trucks. Lieutenant Colonel R.B. Staver had a crazy idea. What if you mounted rockets on a tank? His team at Aberdeen Proving Grounds worked frantically. They created a launcher with 60 tubes. Each tube fired a 4.5-inch rocket. Each rocket carried 20 pounds of high explosives. Do the math. That's 200 pounds of explosives in under a minute. The launcher looked bizarre. It towered over the Sherman's turret like a second gun. Soldiers took one look and started laughing. It reminded them of a Calliope, those loud steam organs from circuses. The name stuck. But nobody would be laughing when the rockets started flying. The M4 Sherman was America's workhorse tank. Reliable, tough, but nothing fancy. The Calliope gave it a terrifying new personality. No longer just armor and a cannon. Now it was a rolling artillery barrage. Engineers spent months perfecting the system. Electrical wiring let crews fire all 60 rockets in rapid succession. The mounting system had to be strong enough to handle the recoil. The whole contraption weighed thousands of pounds. Loading was back-breaking work. Each rocket weighed 20 pounds. Crews had to hoist them into position manually. Fill all 60 tubes, and you'd worked for hours. But once loaded, the Calliope could unleash hell in seconds. The rockets weren't accurate by design. They spread over a wide area. Think of it as saturation bombing from a tank. You didn't aim at a specific bunker. You aimed at everything in front of you. By early 1944, prototypes were ready. Test after test proved the concept. When 60 rockets fired together, they created a wall of fire. Buildings vanished. Positions were obliterated. Even hardened observers were shaken by the destruction. American commanders saw the potential immediately. Here was firepower that could move with tank battalions. No waiting for artillery from the rear. No calling for air support. Just drive up and destroy whatever stood in your way. The Calliope's combat debut came in September 1944. American forces were grinding through northern France. German defenses had regrouped after Normandy. Every village was a fortress. Every river crossing was a death trap. Units of the 12th Army Group mounted Calliopes on their Shermans. The first time they fired in anger, everyone was stunned, including the Americans pulling the triggers. 60 rockets shrieked overhead in a single wave. The sound was indescribable. Like metal screaming. Like the world ending. German positions simply vanished in smoke and fire. Near the Moselle River in November 1944, a single Calliope changed everything. A German strongpoint had held up an American advance for hours. Machine gun nests commanded every approach. Infantry attacks failed repeatedly. Then, a Calliope-equipped Sherman rolled up behind cover. The crew loaded their rockets, aimed at the German position, and fired. 60 rockets screamed across the battlefield in 45 seconds. The strongpoint disappeared. Entire buildings collapsed. Men were buried under rubble. The survivors fled in terror. American infantry advanced immediately. They found only scattered resistance, bodies in the debris, weapons abandoned. The position that had held them up for hours was gone in under a minute. This became the Calliope's signature: sudden, overwhelming, decisive. German prisoners later described their shock. They thought they'd been bombed from the air. The idea that one tank could unleash such destruction was inconceivable. Veterans of the Eastern Front compared it to Soviet Katyushas. But those fired from trucks miles away. This came from armor on the front line. For German soldiers, the Calliope wasn't just another Allied weapon. It was a nightmare with no frame of reference. Imagine you're dug into a farmhouse in Lorraine. You've survived artillery barrages. You've dodged bombing runs. You think you understand war. Then you hear a sound like 60 demons screaming at once. The rockets streak overhead. You have maybe 10 seconds to wonder what's happening. Then your world explodes. Captured German reports from late 1944 tell the story. Confusion and disbelief. Some units thought they were under air attack. Others assumed massive artillery batteries had targeted them. The idea that the rockets came from a single tank was impossible to accept. One Wehrmacht sergeant captured near Metz told interrogators, "We thought the Americans had found a way to fire 60 guns at once from one tank. No man wanted to face that twice." The sensory assault was devastating. The shriek of rockets tearing through air, the simultaneous wall of explosions, dust and debris filling trenches, the ground shaking violently, communication breaking down instantly. Many survivors described being too dazed to fight effectively afterward. Unlike artillery that came in waves, the Calliope felt immediate and unstoppable. Entire street blocks vanished in under a minute. Defenders scattered before American infantry even arrived. Fear spread quickly through German ranks. Rumors magnified the weapon's power. Stories of entire battalions wiped out in seconds. In reality, the Calliope was never that precise. But the belief in its unstoppable force was sometimes more valuable than the rockets themselves. German civilians were equally shaken. Villagers thought bombers must have passed overhead. The level of destruction seemed impossible from ground fire alone. To them, it was indistinguishable from an air raid. Except it happened with no warning at point-blank range. By late 1944, rumors about American rocket tanks spread everywhere. Some soldiers claimed the Allies must have hundreds of them. In reality, the numbers were small. But fear magnified the Calliope's impact. It became legend on the battlefield. Winter 1944 brought Germany's last great offensive. The Battle of the Bulge caught Americans off guard. Snow-covered forests, narrow roads, desperate German counterattacks across the Ardennes. Several Calliope Shermans were rushed into action. Dense forests made maneuvering artillery difficult, but tanks could still push forward. The Calliopes cleared forested areas where German troops were dug in. Picture an American column entering a small Belgian hamlet. They stop short of the main square. One Calliope salvo turns half the town into rubble. Then infantry moves in to mop up scattered resistance. For GIs caught in brutal cold, the weapon wasn't just firepower. It was relief. Fewer house-to-house firefights. Fewer casualties in ambushes. The Calliope broke German positions before Americans had to assault them. During river crossings toward the Rhine in early 1945, the weapon proved invaluable. German artillery and machine guns guarded every bridgehead. 60 rockets exploding on the far bank didn't guarantee total destruction, but they forced enemy gunners to duck, silenced positions temporarily, gave attackers a chance to move. Commander after commander credited Calliopes with making crossings possible. At Remagen and Oppenheim, where speed and shock were critical, the rocket tanks cleared the way. As terrifying as the Calliope was, it wasn't perfect. American crews had a love-hate relationship with their weapon. The 60-tube launcher added massive bulk and weight to Sherman turrets. This made tanks harder to maneuver, especially in tight villages and narrow roads of France and Belgium. Some commanders complained their field of view was restricted. The rocket racks interfered with main gun elevation. Loading was backbreaking work. Each rocket weighed 20 pounds. Crews hoisted them into place manually. Filling all 60 tubes took hours. Once fired, the launcher had to be reloaded away from front lines. Many crews joked the Calliope was a one-shot wonder. Accuracy remained a persistent problem. Unlike artillery shells aimed with precision, Calliope rockets were unguided. They fired in a spread pattern, excellent for saturation bombardment, nearly useless for pinpoint strikes. The launch system was vulnerable too. Perched high above the tank, it made Sherman's easy targets. German Panzerfaust teams quickly learned that Calliopes stood out on battlefields. Knocking one out eliminated a unique weapon that could devastate their positions. Some crews tried camouflaging launchers with tarps or foliage, anything to avoid drawing extra attention. For many tankers, the Calliope turned their Sherman into a clumsy target. They had enough to worry about facing Panthers and Tigers without hauling around an oversized rocket rack. Only a few hundred Calliopes were ever deployed. They were assigned to specific armored battalions rather than issued universally. Commanders understood their strengths, but recognized their limitations. Best used for shocking defenses at the start of attacks, not for sustained fighting or dueling with enemy armor. The Sherman Calliope joined a fearsome family of World War II rocket weapons. Each had its own personality and purpose. The Soviet BM-13 Katyusha became legendary first. Used since 1941, Germans nicknamed it the Stalin organ. It operated from trucks, which meant mobility, but also vulnerability. One lucky artillery strike could knock out an entire battery. The Calliope was different. Mounted on a tank, it had armor protection. It could move with frontline troops. That made it more survivable, though less numerous than Soviet rocket trucks. Germans had their own equivalent. The Nebelwerfer fired 6 to 36 rockets, depending on the model. Allied soldiers nicknamed it the Screaming Mimi because of the distinctive shriek. But like the Katyusha, Nebelwerfers were towed or mounted on half-tracks, vulnerable once spotted. The Calliope's innovation was combining firepower with armor protection. Still, it was far less common than either the Katyusha or Nebelwerfer. Soviets built thousands of rocket trucks. Germans fielded large numbers across every front. Americans produced only a few hundred Calliope units. Part of this was doctrine. The U.S. relied heavily on massive artillery corps. With seemingly endless supplies of conventional guns, American commanders didn't need mass rocket launchers like the Soviets used as force multipliers. In combat effect, though, the Calliope could match its counterparts. During Rhine crossings in early 1945, Allied officers noted how effective Calliope salvos were at suppressing German defenses. Just like Soviet Katyushas had shocked the Wehrmacht years earlier, by spring 1945, Allied forces surged into Germany itself. The Sherman Calliope fired some of its last salvos of the war. Though limited in numbers, its impact in those final months was memorable. At towns along the Rhine, Calliope-equipped Shermans broke stubborn defenses quickly. The weapon had become a symbol of overwhelming Allied firepower pressing down on the collapsing Reich. In March 1945, As U.S. forces prepared major Rhine crossings, Calliopes hammered German fortifications guarding riverbanks. The combination of artillery, air power, and rocket tanks created what survivors described as a rolling wall of destruction. For defenders already stretched thin, the sudden roar of 60 rockets from tanks on the near bank added to the sense that resistance was hopeless. In some sectors, Calliope opening barrages drove defenders from positions before American infantry reached the far side. The weapon was also used pushing through central Germany. Villages and towns became fortified pockets of resistance. Many German units were under strength by then, filled with hastily conscripted boys and older men. Facing a Calliope strike in such conditions was devastating. Witnesses remembered defenders abandoning positions in panic once rockets fell, leaving behind weapons and running from chaos. For soldiers lacking training and resolve of earlier Wehrmacht units, the Calliope's psychological blow was heavier than its physical destruction. After the war ended, German officers interviewed by Allied intelligence often mentioned the Calliope as one of the weapons that caught them off guard. Several admitted they initially believed the U.S. had entire divisions equipped with rocket tanks. In reality, only a few battalions ever used them. The myth became larger than the weapon itself. Klaus Weber survived the war. He returned to his village in Bavaria, started a small farm, raised children who never knew hunger or fear. But on quiet mornings, when thunder rolled across the fields, he would pause. Listen. Remember that sound of 60 rockets screaming overhead, the earth shaking, buildings collapsing. The moment when a single American tank changed everything. For Weber, and thousands like him, the Sherman Calliope was more than a weapon. It was proof that American innovation could match German engineering, Soviet firepower, Allied determination. The Calliope never became mass-produced standard equipment. Its flaws were real. Too cumbersome for sustained fighting. Too inaccurate for precision strikes. Too vulnerable when mounted high on tank turrets. But in the final desperate months of World War II, even an imperfect weapon could tilt the balance. The Calliope terrified enemies, boosted American assaults, left an unforgettable mark on European battlefields. Its combination of rockets and armor foreshadowed post-war developments. Modern armies would adopt self-propelled rocket artillery as standard tools. The Calliope was one of the earliest attempts to blend tank mobility with saturation fire. In that sense, it was ahead of its time. For American troops, it was remembered with pride and practicality. Loud, cumbersome, sometimes awkward to operate. But when unleashed, it could change the course of a fight. Veterans described satisfaction of watching entrenched defenses dissolve in seconds. Artillery on tracks that gave armored units independence. The Germans never forgot those salvos. For many, the memory of a Sherman tank suddenly sprouting fire and thunder from 60 tubes became a lasting symbol of Allied dominance. A reminder that in war, innovation matters as much as courage. By May 1945, when Germany surrendered, the Calliope had written its brief but fiery chapter. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't built in massive numbers, but it served its purpose: to terrify, to destroy, to remind the enemy that American ingenuity was unstoppable. The Sherman Calliope, a circus organ that played symphonies of destruction. A weapon born from desperation, perfected in battle, remembered forever by those who heard its terrible song. Weber never forgot. None of them did. And perhaps that was the Calliope's greatest victory of all.